really happy to welcome you to the 14th annual Robbins Collection Lecture in Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity. The annual lecture is a joint project of Berkeley's Robbins Collection in Religious and Civil Law and the Helen Diller Institute's program on Jewish Law, Thought, and Identity. The Robbins Collection, which some of you know and many of you may not yet have heard of, is a major center for comparative research and study in religious and civil law. And it organizes workshops and conferences and lectures and holds over 300,000 holdings, including rare religious law and many Jewish law manuscripts dating as far back as the 12th century. And we're grateful for the leadership and ongoing partnership of Robbins. On one of the tables is the list of the 14 past Robbins lectures, and you'll see that this collection and this partnership predates even the creation of the Helen Diller Institute 11 years ago. This is kind of where it all started. And we're so grateful to the ongoing partnership with Robbins professor Laurent Miley, as well as of Emily Best and the entire staff of the collection, and we look forward to many more years of continued collaboration on religious law at Berkeley. Thank you, Laurent. This year, we're honored to host as our Robbins Collection lecturer, Diller Institute Visiting Professor of Psychology, Daniel Levy. He'll be speaking on the Executioner's Prayer, what evolutionary neuroscience and Talmudic tradition teach us about the roles of punishment in society. Professor Levy is on the faculty and former dean of the Baruch Ivcher School of Psychology at Reichman University, the university formerly known as IDC, and there he heads its cognitive neuroscience lab. That lab focuses on understanding human memory and attention, working on, among other matters, the ways in which Parkinson's disease impacts on orienting of attention in space, and the pathways by which our sense of touch creates memory traces, and the use of rhythmic electrical stimulation to strengthen newly acquired memories. Also there, at the IDC Reichman Law School, he developed a popular course called The Laws of Life, which integrates insights from biblical and rabbinic literature with empirical perspectives from psychology and neuroscience and evolutionary biology to enable students to appreciate legal issues from novel angles. In addition to his work in neuroscience, he's also working on a project that, in this interdisciplinary vein, explores the ways in which identity is formed, integrating neuroscience insights, theories of identity, and Jewish sources. And he's written a piece of musical theater on the expulsion of the Jews from Spain in 1492. So that may be our next public event. Professor Levy is one of 8 visiting professors the Diller Institute has brought to Berkeley to teach our students this year. He's our first ever visiting professor in psychology and our first engaged in the hard sciences. And he's the first of our visiting professors to deliver the Robbins lecture. So I'm especially excited for this opportunity to share with the community some of the experience our students have been privileged to get in the classroom. Please join me in welcoming Professor Daniel Levy. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Ken. Thank you to everybody for coming out this afternoon.
A little louder.
I'm rarely asked to speak more loudly. I'm going to take that as a compliment. And I want to thank the Helen Diller Institute and Rebecca and the members of the staff who have made it possible for me to spend this academic year at Berkeley and to continue on next semester. It's been a wonderful experience. I've learned a lot here on campus, both within the Diller framework and a lot of other things. I'm also very grateful to the Department of Psychology and especially the laboratory of Professor Robert T. Knight, which has been hosting me this year. And it's been wonderful to engage with the students here at Berkeley, and I'm also glad to have the opportunity to engage with the community. So let's talk about the executioner's prayer. Unless, like me, you spend most of your time living under a rock, you might have noticed that our culture seems to be rather obsessed with the topic of crime and punishment. Movies and TV series are inordinately devoted to law offices and courts, private investigators and police work, in past, present, and generally dystopian future societies. From Wyatt Earp to RoboCop, and from the death of an expert witness to Breaking Bad, we might actually be more drawn to murder mysteries than we are to love stories, seemingly a triumph of Thanatos over Eros. And when considering media coverage of events in the real world, crime reporting is notably prominent, especially in populist and social media feeds. Politicians know that running on a law and order platform gets them easy mileage, or as we say in Israel, easy kilometrage. And like many entry-level jobs, no experience necessary. People who might have spent their entire lives without personally having undergone violence or theft are still entranced by tales of criminal investigation and mesmerized by courtroom dramas, real or idealized. We seem to be living in a never-ending game of Clue. Well, why are we like this? Are we all victims of cultural brainwashing that focuses our innocent attention on crime and punishment against our natural will? The rabbis of the Talmud have a saying that seems relevant. The road that a person wants to walk on is the one on which they are escorted. Purveyors of news and entertainment, politicians, and other salespeople that push our crime and punishment buttons are just taking advantage of human behavioral tendencies that seem incredibly basic and possibly innate and even genetically determined in one sense. This should not surprise us. Humans as social animals are constantly required to engage in negotiated trade-offs in which we balance our absolute autonomy and unbridled pursuit of immediate self-interest with the constraints required for social interdependence. Other people can be our greatest benefactors and our bitterest enemies. We can't live without them, but sometimes it sure is tough to live with them. Doing so requires us to constantly monitor if the principles of cooperation under which we operate, in whichever culture we happen to find ourselves, are being upheld by those with whom we interact. It stands to reason that persons who are especially good at doing such monitoring might survive and thrive more than people who blissfully ignore their exploitation by others. In other words, such tendencies are adaptive. They might have come to be selected in the course of evolutionary development through the transmission of basic behavioral sensitivities and reactivities grounded in brain structure and function. And then, just as our evolutionary need for energy can lead us to prefer unnourishing artificial sweeteners over bland flavors, and just as our sexual urges are sometimes satisfied by pornography, though it has no reproductive value, our justice monitoring system is gratified even when we exercise it in artificial circumstances, like the vicarious pleasure in watching Hercule Poirot solve a crime, or the satisfaction that we might feel hearing a news item about a far-off court convicting a scoundrel who took advantage of elderly persons in an internet scam. In the balance of this talk, I'd like to share an approach to thinking about judicial punishment, which is inspired by the kind of evolutionary thinking I've just introduced. I'm going to argue that in order to serve society, institutions of judicial punishment must be responsive not only to the material needs, but also to the psychological needs of the members of that society. Institutions of punishment must be sensitive to evolutionary factors that have shaped the way people experience, think, feel, and react, both as individuals and as members of groups. Importantly, this sensitivity must be used not only to empathize with the victims of crime or to inform our understanding of its perpetrators, but to serve all those who support and are supported by a given system of criminal and civil justice. Awareness of these psychological factors must guide legislation of codes of justice, as well as their execution in individual cases. Indeed, the reference to the executioner in the title of this talk is not, as in traditional parlance, to a hangman or to a member of a firing squad, but to all those involved in law enforcement, legislators, police persons, judges, and jailers. These people's responsibility in forming and executing the measures required to keep society functioning is exceedingly weighty. The task is hard, the peril's great, and they can only pray to get it right. Later in this talk, I will espouse some unconventional and seemingly reactionary approaches to instruments of societal and legal punishment. Therefore, at the outset, I would like to stress that legal punishments, sadly, often result from the failures of societies to be just and charitable to all their members. Many violent and exploitative crimes are likely to occur in environments in which individuals are oppressed, frustrated, and deprived of their ability to thrive by the dint of their efforts. The optimal state of society is achieved by the affordance of truly equal access to resources, by institutional benevolence towards those less privileged because of innate or environmental factors, and proactive steps to address historical sources of inequality. Public policies that help citizens thrive should be our first line of action in creating societies in which all participants are safe and at peace. Punishment and the societal institutions that employ it should be a last resort. Having said that, there are also more than enough cases in which crimes are committed by persons with sufficient life privileges not to have any excuse for exploiting or harming others. The Bernie Madoffs, the Elizabeth Holmeses, and the Harvey Weinsteins of the world. The gang members who just a few months ago slaughtered a whole family in the Central Valley in a turf war, including a 16-year-old mother and her baby boy shot in the head trying to flee, and their 72-year-old grandmother. And of course, there are countless other less famous but equally egregious criminals, especially in the cases of such exploitative and, I will say, evil offenders. It remains to be determined how judicial punishment can be most effective when appropriate. Let us proceed to examine that. There are two regnant philosophical approaches to the principles of judicial punishment. One is the consequentialist approach, based on the utilitarian tradition of Jeremy Bentham and his school. This approach to punishment emphasizes deterrence, removing dangerous people from society, and obliging offenders to undergo rehabilitation. In contrast, the retributive approach identified with the teachings of Immanuel Kant holds that criminals should be punished for improper deeds that they have done, simply because of the inner evil they reflect, regardless of the consequences of such punishments for the future. Let's unpack these principles. First, for the consequentialist view. According to utilitarian philosophy, the purpose of all laws is to maximize the aggregate welfare of society. Right? Famous principle, the greatest good for the greatest number. As any act of punishment creates suffering and thus reduces aggregate welfare, it will be justified only if it leads to the prevention of even greater suffering. In addition to crime prevention, through deterrence afforded by the prospect of punishment and removal of offenders from open society, this approach incorporates forced rehabilitation, thus the sense in which prisons are called correctional institutions. In contrast, the retributive approach completely ignores the consequences of punishment and its deterrence component, and is based entirely on considering the criminal act and the appropriate punishment for it. Kant teaches that punishment should never be imposed as a means of promoting any benefit to society, since humans are important as ends in themselves. Right? A quote, juridical punishment can never be administered merely as a means of promoting another good. Right? The person is the center of things. It is in this sense that prisons are also referred to as penitentiaries. In whatever punishment is fit to a given crime, there is to be an element of retribution, paying back, literally, with the goal of finding an appropriate ratio between the severity of the act and the nature or degree of punishment administered. Punishment based on the principle of retribution was manifest in the United States in the 1970s under the policy of just deserts. That policy developed in the wake of findings that imprisonment did not achieve its intended corrective purpose, did not really accomplish rehabilitation, which led to demands that it be set aside. A committee addressing this issue at the time proposed to give just deserts punishments, to be determined, following Kant, on two aspects of the offense: the actual damage caused and the degree of guilt. That noble-sounding term, just deserts, might be hiding a deeper, darker motivation, the instinct for revenge. I will unpack the revenge instinct shortly, but in the meantime, I would just like to note that judges have done impressive conceptual somersaults to avoid the impression that their verdicts might reflect anything like revenge. And since I'm visiting from Israel, I'd like to share two historical examples from the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court. Here's one. In the serious nature of the offense before, I translated this. They're in Hebrew, usually, but this is what it says. In the serious nature of the offense before us and the circumstances of its commission, we may not ignore the consideration of retribution, which expresses an appropriate relationship between the severity of the offense and the severity of the punishment. Not as an act of revenge, God forbid, but as an expression of revulsion and disgust regarding the embezzlement, and that was what the case was about, by the defendant of public funds that were given to him due to absolute confidence in his honesty and fairness, right? No, not revenge. Or here's another one. That was Anonymous versus v. State of Israel, 1981. Here's Fadida v. State of Israel, 1993. Indeed, retribution as revenge is not a legitimate aspect of judicial punishment. But when it comes to punishment for a serious crime, such as the one before us, retribution expressing abhorrence of and revulsion by the crime, which warps the basic nature of human society, is appropriate. The severity of the punishment expresses condemnation of the act and abhorrence of it. How, though, can we distinguish between a punishment imposed out of disgust and revulsion and one imposed from revenge considerations? Perhaps, as we will see soon, there's a powerful motivator of punishment here: hiding in plain sight. Getting back to Bentham and Kant, it could be argued that consequentialist and retributive approaches are not necessarily contradictory, and that they can be reconciled and complement each other in guiding punitive decisions. However, in an important study published 20 years ago, Carl Smith and colleagues pointed out that various aspects of a crime would lead to different decisions regarding punishment in accordance with these two principles. Retributive considerations focus on the degree of damage to the victim and the intention of the criminal as the crucial factors, while the consequentialist view would focus on public awareness of the crime and the chances of it being discovered, designing greater penalties for crimes that are more difficult to detect and treat for deterrence purposes. Now, if you ask ordinary citizens how they would decide in a range of cases which they're given to consider as if they were judges, they often claim that what guides them in their thinking about punishment are utilitarian, consequentialist considerations, not retaliatory, doing justice considerations. In practice, though, when these considerations would lead to different sentences, Carl Smith and colleagues found that the general public's choices usually reflect retributive considerations, not those of prevention. People talk a social dynamics game, but act out of revenge. And actions speak louder than words. What could be the reason for this cognitive dissonance? It remains to be seen whether a psychological, biological understanding of human punishment behaviors might explain this phenomenon. So, what do we know about the origins and mechanisms of human attitudes towards punishment and punishment behaviors? Humans are among the relatively small number of species that live socially. We arguably have more complex societies than other species. But before we compliment ourselves on our uniqueness, it is instructive to note that some of those other social animals display behaviors that seem akin to human judicial punishing. For example, ravens, who have enormously impressive cognitive abilities, show evidence of third-party involvement in order to maintain social order. There is a social norm that any raven that holds food can keep it, regardless of its status relative to the other ravens present. And that's different from a lot of other avian species in which there's a pecking order, right, where the dominant individual always gets to eat first. A raven that violates this rule and attempts to take some of the food of a different raven will be attacked by yet a third raven, who is not necessarily a victim, not necessarily a relative of the victim of the theft. The punisher does not gain any direct personal benefit from punishing the thief. It seems then that maintaining social norms is so important to ravens that they will punish violation of that norm even if they themselves have not been harmed. Pretty impressive for a bird brain, eh? Yeah, okay. Or a little bit closer to us on the evolutionary tree, take macaque monkeys. They live in groups, and individuals who discovered preferred food sources tend to make special food calls to inform the rest of the group. Monkeys who do not share their good fortune with the rest of the group by thus signaling have a higher probability of falling victim to group aggression than those who do signal. You cooperate with your group, you get treated nicely. You're selfish, you pay the price. And here's an interesting finding. In several human justice systems throughout history, family members of a criminal have paid a price for their relative's crime. So, in the 17th century BCE laws of Hammurabi of Babylon, if a traitor holds a free man in prison against his will on the grounds that he owes him a financial debt, and that prisoner dies from beatings or abuse, the traitor's son must die in response. Section 116. Also, if a man strikes a free woman and she dies, then the daughter of the slayer is to be killed. Section 210. The Hebrew biblical tradition seems to refer to this principle ostensibly in order to reject it. So, regarding retributive justice following a person's being gored to death by an ox, right? There were a lot of angry oxen back in biblical days. The book of Exodus tells us, and it is stressed, that also if a son is gored or a daughter is gored, this sentence will be done. That is, the owner of the ox and not the member of the family is the one who is liable to punishment. And that's Exodus 21. This ruling and some other biblical statements explicitly reject the Babylonian approach. So, in a different verse from Deuteronomy, sons shall not be put to death for the offenses of the fathers, nor fathers for the offenses of sons. A man for his sin shall be put to death. Ish becheto yumat. So, okay, unlike those primitive Babylonians who involve family members in punishment, according to the Hebrew biblical laws, everybody's responsible for their own actions. Yeah, except for one important exception. Elsewhere in the Bible, the family approach is identified as a reflection of divine justice. For I am the Lord your God, a jealous God, visiting the sins of fathers upon sons, and upon the third and fourth generation for those who hate me. Okay? Also, that's from the Ten Commandments. So, God is fairly vengeful, and the sons pay for the crimes of the fathers. So, what might be the evolutionary source of this intergenerational punishments? So, looking into nature, we can consider vervet monkeys. Among the vervets, adult females that have been deprived of food sources will seek out and attack family members of their dispossessor. Okay? They don't hit back directly, they hit the family members, maybe juveniles who are a little bit less strong and less capable of defending themselves. But what's the logic behind human and monkey punishment of family members of the offenders? We can actually understand this in evolutionary terms as reflecting the struggle between members of gene pools for reproductive fitness. And that is one of the foundations of biological thinking. The idea being that all of our behavioral tendencies are shaped by our genes in order to pass on as many of those genes possible to future living creatures. So we're not only concerned in what drives us in our behaviors is not concerned with ourselves, but with us as reproductive vehicles. If a conspecific, which is a fancy way of saying another animal of your kind, deprives you of resources that enable you to thrive and reproduce and pass on your genes, you protect your relative standing in your ecological niche by reducing the reproductive fitness of your competitors. The ancient legal codes, Hammurabi, Exodus, and others, reflect many generations of human interactions in which evolutionarily shaped behaviors coalesced into social institutions which were subsequently enshrined in laws. These and additional punitive behaviors of other animals can thus be summarized as follows. They are mainly expressed in relationships between members of the same species, especially among social animals. They help maintain social order. They are often conducted by the strongest members of the group. They address crimes that parallel human acts of theft, resource exploitation, and territorial invasion. And they can be seemingly altruistic. Most importantly, these behaviors appear to be innate and driven by instinct. Although we can have no clear knowledge of the level of awareness of animals and the character of such awareness, it is difficult to assume that monkeys, crows, naked mole rats, and bees act out of conscious insight when punishing other members of their species. However, those behaviors make great evolutionary sense because they are adaptive, that is, they contribute to survival and reproduction. Birds do it, bees do it, even those who speak legalese do it. Knowing this, we can look at human punishment thinking and behavior in a new light. So what has science discovered about human punishment tendencies? Interesting insights have come from behavioral economics and from the relatively new field of neuroeconomics, which attempt to delineate people's behaviors in advancing their interests in social contexts, and to understand the brain processes underlying such behaviors. One rich source of insights is the observation of how people behave in a public goods game, a simple but realistic model of how economic relations work in society. Let me take a moment to introduce you to this model. The so-called public goods in this game are benefits that members of a group reap by collaboration. In this example, there are 8 players, right? 8 people around the table, each beginning the game with the same amount of resources. In this British case, £10 sterling. They are members of a joint venture. That's not necessarily a marijuana business, but since we're in California, it could be, right? It's okay. Importantly, the members are entitled to equal share in its profits under any circumstances. That's important, okay? They all get the same profits. All members are invited, but not required, to contribute resources to that joint venture. The venture is a promising one. In fact, under the terms of the game, it is guaranteed to bring participants a 4-fold return on all investments. Remember the good old days about 2 years ago when our index funds were like that? You know, just making money? Well, that's what this game does, and it's guaranteed. So if everyone puts £5 into the pot, it's in the second table over there, for a total of £40 of investment, there will be 40 times 4 equals 160 pounds of profits to distribute, such that all now hold 30 pounds, their original 10 and the 20 that they split, of 160 divided by 8. So far, so good. But what happens if one of the players, perhaps a former cryptocurrency trader, realizes that she or he can game the system, not contribute seed money, and yet share equally in the eventual profits? In this case, the investment pool will be lower, only 35 pounds, yielding only 140 pounds of profits. But the rules of the game are such that all 8 members get an equal share of that pie, irrespective of what each one initially contributed. So now everybody gets $17.50, and the sly member who only put in 5 instead of 10 is now 5 pounds ahead of the other partners. They all have $22.50, and he has $27.50. So now he has an advantage over his erstwhile equal partners, and he can turn that advantage to nefarious purposes. How do you think the other players will feel when they discover that one of their partners is an exploiter, a defector, a free rider, as the economists call it? Hopping mad, right? And they're not going to be fooled twice. In the next round of investment, other players also withhold their money. And pretty soon, the whole structure comes crashing down. Such behavior is irrational, as by reacting in that fashion, the other players lose all possible profits that they might have accrued. But anger at being exploited unfairly is stronger than rational considerations of overall personal welfare. There's only one way out of this mess. In a different version of the game, the other players have the capacity to punish free riders who don't contribute their share. And boy, do they use that capacity. Even if it costs them money to punish the offender, they do so with gusto. That punishment option indeed keeps potential defectors in line and maintains the system on a long-term basis. Even more interestingly, in versions of the game in which each group of investors only plays together once, exploited players, like what just happened here, are willing to spend money to punish a miscreant who has free-ridden in the round of activity just completed, even if they will never play the game with that person again. In a sense, this is altruistic punishment. It brings the people who pay money to punish no future benefit, but it might help other players not to be exploited by the free rider in the next rounds of the game. We're thinking about posterity here when we're engaging in punishment. And in perhaps the most intriguing study, participants played a computerized version of the public goods game while their brain activity was mapped using PET scans. In cases that participants were about to punish exploitative players, activity was recorded in their striatum, an area of the brain important for learning the reward value of actions. Participants who exhibited stronger activity in that reward-related brain area were willing to pay a higher personal cost in order to punish free riders. This and other studies using additional behavioral economics models, such as the dictator game, the ultimatum game, the prisoner's dilemma, pretty dismal business, these economics games, aren't they? All of them seem to indicate that feelings of satisfaction that people get in punishing exploiters and the neural mechanisms that support such feelings are a basis not only of reactive punishments to defend one's own self-interest, but also of third-party altruistic punishment behavior. To put it simplistically, but hopefully not totally inaccurately, our brains are wired to punish social offenders, even when such punishment is costly to us. The sense of reward we feel when punishing criminals is a proximate cause that gives an incentive to punishers, even without complex cognitive calculations of long-term costs and benefits to us. That's the hallmark of a biological mechanism shaped by evolutionary processes. Thus far, we've explored the drives supporting how individuals respond to their exploitation by other agents. But as far back as we have records, and probably long before that, people living in groups have generally given up on dealing with defectors and free riders individually in favor of societal institutions. There are good reasons for this. Mathematical models show that in the development of a group, when punished persons can respond and punish the punishers, the costs of the primary punishment causes those punishers to cease their activity, which leads to the disruption of cooperation within the group. When there are power imbalances between members of a group, the problem is even more severe. So even though we think we have a good solution here, the possibility of retribution by evildoers against the agents of justice is a major problem. Well, how has humanity solved that problem? In traditional societies, punishment is usually done by a leader who is generally the most powerful in the group and therefore less vulnerable, or by a leader who has traditional authority and enjoys support of the rest of the group. In both cases, due to their status, the leaders benefit from an expanded share of the group resources. They may therefore invest some of those resources in punishing offenders, because they will get a larger share of societal resources that are thus protected from exploitation by such criminals. In modern societies, law enforcement agencies are usually given special protection against criminals so that they are not punished for punishing. This is evidenced by the many resources invested in apprehending criminals who have harmed police officers and judges. I'm originally from New York, and since I remember, I saw the bumper stickers on all the cars that says, call 1-800-COP-SHOT to report violence against police officers and receive a $10,000 reward for an anonymous tip of somebody who would have hurt a police officer in the execution of their duty. In these ways, modern police and court institutions have inherited the roles and resources once held by traditional leaders in the small groups that characterized the early stages of human social evolution. There's a direct line from the earliest bands, tribes, and clans in which we lived and the institutions of justice and punishment that developed spontaneously there on the basis of our evolutionarily honed tendencies, and the institutions of law in society today. Seemingly, such a Hobbesian leviathan is necessary in all large-scale societies. When individuals sign over their ability to respond to offenders to centralized authority and cease to take the law into their own hands, that central authority now has the role not only of keeping the peace, but of providing for the psychological welfare of those individuals who have entrusted authority into their hands. Punishing offenders is intrinsically rewarding, and when law-abiding people do not get the reward that they expect to receive in seeing criminals punished, that is biologically equivalent to punishment. Deprivation of reward is neurally equivalent to punishment. And although that's not intuitive, it has been found to characterize many of the fundamental brain system, both in humans and in many other animals. One can understand the negative value experienced in terms of a citizen's frustration in thinking of a criminal who has not been caught and punished. That undermines our trust and our willingness to cooperate with what the social system demands of us. In contrast, citizens will play ball with their government and justice system if they feel that those institutions succeed in enforcing the law as equally and fully as possible. I would therefore argue that just punishment has a positive utilitarian value for the whole of society, for citizens who are made aware of punishment for offenses by criminals, even beyond the ability of punishments to prevent future offenses. This idea is somewhat reminiscent of the biblical saying from the book of Proverbs, "In the good of the righteous shall the city exult, and in the eradication of the wicked there is joy." Importantly, there are several collateral benefits of having effective justice systems beyond the obvious ones. One of these is that the institutionalization of punishment engenders a reduction in the prevalence of individual acts of revenge, and the transformation of cultures of revenge, which in the sociological literature are sometimes called cultures of honor, into cultures of societal protection of individuals, from blood feud to law and order. Another benefit is that by shifting the responsibility for punishment from the individual to the institutions of society, we liberate ourselves from obsessively thinking about crimes committed, which such obsessive thinking would otherwise be an adaptive tendency, motivating us to take action against those who appropriate our resources. By passing on that obligation to legal and policing institutions, we reduce stress and anxiety for all members of society. That only works if the institutions are functioning effectively on our behalf. Furthermore, if we understand that human beings have a basic tendency to punish, driven by evolutionary considerations, to the point of being ready to execute altruistic punishment, positive psychology can give us another important insight. Transferring responsibility for punishment to social institutions allows the rest of us to begin processes of forgiveness of an offender. Things that are expressed in statements like, the criminal has paid their debt to society and therefore we can now welcome them back into being a citizen like the rest of us. Such process of forgiveness is not only beneficial to the miscreant, but emotionally healthy for all of us. I want to talk a bit about the systems and types of punishment that might be most appropriate or most effective, given the processes that we have examined. Thinking within the box of incarceration as the main tool of punishment, we distinguish between various criminal acts quantitatively. So many months of jail for this offense, so many years of imprisonment for that offense. But perhaps we should explore or re-explore more qualitatively different punishment modalities. One consideration that should affect the type and amount of punishment is the cost of punishment relative to the benefit inherent in it in terms of deterrence, prevention, or compensation. Okay? The prison system is incredibly expensive. Is it worth it to us to pay all that money to attain the goals which it ostensibly provides for us? The cost to society, to criminals' families when their family members are incarcerated, and to the offenders themselves of lengthy prison terms should be weighed against the benefit gained from them. The biological utilitarian approach might lead to more creative expansion of the pool of punishment methods. For example, in the direction of compensating victims directly by the criminal who harms them through long-term support obligations. Even more radically, we might consider using means that are currently considered inappropriate in many societies, such as punishing by causing pain or physical harm. Now, caution is definitely required here. The dangers inherent in the actual use of physical punishment are very clear and required careful review to ensure the safety of the innocent. And this is radically true regarding capital punishment. But even the use of imprisonment has risks. And I would humbly submit that the loss of individual freedom occurring in decades-long prison sentences can be considered a more serious violation of individual dignity than corporal punishment, though I recognize that interpersonal differences of opinion regarding this matter can be very large. There is something psychologically powerful about corporal punishment, not only for the recipient, but also for members of the public which it serves, and for those who administer it. I'd like to share an insight from rabbinic literature that reflects that power. The Hebrew Bible lists some 20-odd ritual offenses for which the specified punishment is that the offender is to be cut off from his or her people. The Hebrew term is karet, literally meaning cutting off. Originally, historically, that was probably intended to be some form of exile or ostracism. The rabbis of the Talmud, though, understood karet as a form of imperceptible divine punishment, to be supplemented by lashes administered by human tribunals. The Talmud teaches us in Tractate Megillah. And in this text, the bold words are the literal text, and the less bold is a little interpretative interpolations. I just want to be clear here. All those liable to receive karet who were flogged are exempted from their punishment of karet. As it is stated, lest your brother be debased before your eyes. What does that mean? Once he is flogged, he is as your brother, as his sin has been atoned and he is no longer excised from the Jewish people. This is the statement of Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel. And in the Sefer to Deuteronomy, Rabbi Hanania ben Gamliel is quoted as making the transformation even more explicit. All that day, says Hanania, right? The day of the trial, the punishment, execution, etc. All that day he is called wicked, as it is written, and if the wicked one, the Rasha, is liable to be flogged, right? He's considered to be a wicked person. But once flogged, Scripture calls him your brother. As it is stated, lest your brother shall be debased before your eyes. I have always found this teaching, ever since I learned it in my childhood, very powerful, although I'm not sure I always understood its significance. I'm going to read it now as a claim that there is restorative power in the cathartic act of corporal punishment that engenders reconciliation and starting anew. I know that this won't sit well with many people, especially since there is a thin line between corporal punishment and torture as employed by sadistic individuals or totalitarian regimes. But as I have noted, the same dangers lurk in the use of incarceration. And I want to say a word about the illustration for this slide. This, I believe it's an early 18th century woodcut, is representing over here a scene in an Ashkenazic German synagogue during the days of the High Holy Days, preceding the Day of Atonement. And what you see over here in this picture are these gentlemen wearing tricorner hats, right? Very popular in those days, not only among the Hessians, but around the rest of the Germans as well. What is happening to them is they are receiving lashes in the synagogue. And the lashes are being administered here by the shamash, by the functionary of the congregation. And the reason that these people are receiving lashes is because they are concerned that they have committed a sin which leaves them liable for that penalty of divine excommunication. And they are asking that the shamash give them lashes. Okay, maybe not that hard, but certainly not with a wet noodle, but with a leather strap, in order that they consider themselves to have undergone the alternative Talmudic punishment and so be released from the divine punishment for which they might be ascribed on the Day of Atonement. So there's this sort of deep intuition of the ability of corporal punishment to lead to a sense of atonement. And this is something which is practiced in many Jewish communities around the world. Of course, it is not unique to Judaism. In Christianity, in Islam, flagellation and self-flagellation is found in many different ritual contexts. I found it interesting that it is also present in Jewish tradition as well. Another implication of the biological utilitarian approach to punishment concerns the nature of the arena in which the punishment is carried out. In the 21st century, no doubt many will object to flogging criminals in the town square, or doing anything else to the criminals in the town square. But punishments that take place away from the eyes of society may not achieve the much-needed benefit of deterring potential criminals. Moreover, when punishment is not public, ordinary citizens do not get a sense that criminals are being punished for their actions, which leads members of society with a sense of frustration I mentioned previously. Consideration should therefore be given to how public exposure to punitive performance can be obtained with respect to any type of punishment that society decides to use. Now, admittedly, some criminal trials, a very small number, receive extensive media coverage, especially when it comes to particularly heinous crimes or to offenses of famous people. But for the most part, criminal justice system and the punishment branch operate outside the spotlight of public awareness. Some people may believe that this is better, but the consequences of such an approach must be taken into account. A meta-analysis of studies examining the effectiveness of deterrence in punishment found that while publicity-rich punishment does not minimize homicides, it has significant deterrent value in cases of property crimes, traffic offenses, and administrative violations. Such deterrence requires communicating the cases of such punishment to all relevant parties, especially to potential offenders, but also to the general public. Another fascinating empirical demonstration of the very basic nature of the desire to witness justice being done is provided in the study of Mendes and colleagues from 2018. They enabled chimpanzees and 6-year-old children to learn through interactions that a certain agent was either prosocial or antisocial. Subsequently, those chimpanzees or children had the opportunity to witness those agents being punished, but at a cost. They had to pay a cost to see the punishment happen. Tokens for the children, physical effort for the chimps. Both the chimps and the 6-year-old children chose to engage in costly viewing of the punishment of antisocial agents. Seemingly, the need to see offenders receiving their just deserts is phylogenetically and ontogenetically very basic. I have cited some evidence from animal behavioral research, behavioral economics, and neuroscience, which provide insights into the complex mechanisms responsible for our thoughts and behavior in the area of punishment. My main contention is that the need to punish criminals is embedded in our biological nature, that the satisfaction of this need is a social desideratum, and that punishment policy should be influenced by this alongside many other practical considerations. Ignoring these considerations of psychology, of evolutionary biology, of human nature, may lead to societal frustration that can undermine support for societal institutions, with a concomitant decline in compliance and cooperation. One might argue that this approach panders to the baser aspects of human nature, and that we should reject the Old Testament notion of a life for a life in favor of the more pacifist approach attributed to a certain first-century rabbi from Nazareth, who was recorded as having said, "You heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil. But if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." Matthew chapter 5. But as I have mentioned at the outset, punishment is not of value in its own right, and in most cases its use means that a deeper failure of societal institutions has occurred. It is hard to accept the harsh realities of effective punishment, But until we build truly just societies in which all can thrive with equal opportunity, we cannot dispense with dispensing justice. This is not a matter to be taken lightly. Rabbi Yonatan is quoted in the Talmud, Bavli Sanhedrin, as proclaiming, "A judge should always imagine himself with a sword resting between his thighs, and Gehenna, the doors to hell, open beneath him." A single misstep in judgment can have dire consequences. How does one live with such responsibility? Perhaps only with humility and awareness of one's limitations. It seems right that such awareness-raising acts of introspection should be built into our judicial procedures. A precedent for this may be found in the liturgy of the High Holy Days. On the cusp of one of the most dramatic moments in the sacred service, the cantor, the chazan, pauses the congregation's prayer to recite a lyric statement of introspection, recognizing his or her limitations and requesting divine assistance in representing those who appointed him or her to stand before the Holy Ark. This is the prayer, Hineni He'ani Mima'as. The title of chazan, by which a cantor is called in later Jewish literature, the person who recited that prayer, originally had a very different connotation. In the earliest sources, the term chazan referred to the executioner, the official charged with administering lashes prescribed by the court. Those officers and the judges who gave them their orders would have done well, just like the contemporary chazan, to pause in prayer, to consider whether their actions were properly serving the societal and spiritual values of their community. And as in the days of the Talmud, so too today, in the context of very different society values, all who serve in the judicial system would do well to learn the executioner's prayer, to hope with all their heart and soul that they are bringing the greatest good to the greatest number, acting out of deeply held principle and a deeply informed understanding of human nature. Understanding the evolutionary and neural underpinnings of why people think and act the way they do about justice and punishment might not lead us to champion particular values, but it might instruct us in how to better translate those values that we do cherish into more effective practical strides for maintaining public order. And that seems something quite appropriate to pray for. Thank you very much.
Thank you for giving this talk. Very, very interesting. I'm curious about some of the implications of what you were saying closer to the end of your talk about, I guess, the social utility of corporal punishment and public punishment. Because in the beginning you said, and I accept this premise, that there's this biological urge, this neurological satisfaction that comes with seeing offenders punished in a visible way. And that there's that sort of artificial satisfying of that need to an extent by watching RoboCop or reading detective novels. And I guess I'm curious why that's bad. If we accept that human beings want to see people punished, why is it not sufficient to have them see people get punished in fictional media? Why do we need to lash people?
So, as a psychologist, I always, attribute very limited understanding of reality to people, but we're not that stupid, right? We are very much concerned with the reality in our society. We don't want to, see avatars being punished. We are concerned that people who are exploiting, our welfare either our physical welfare or economic welfare, we need them to be punished. That is deeply programmed into our genes, according to the evidence that I've tried to present over here. So it's just important that these kinds of punishments be carried out effectively. I want to make it clear that I'm not saying that we should get rid of the system of imprisonment in favor of corporal punishment. There are going to be different cases for which different instruments of punishment are required. And I also think that the even more helpful institution of sort of obliging criminals to engage in future support of people who have been victimized by them is maybe even better. I'm just saying we need to open our filters and look at a broader range of tools which might be effective in protecting our societies and in increasing the cooperation of people with the laws of society by taking their psychological needs into account. So it's, and I'm certainly not saying that these are the particular measures that should be required. Another part of my thinking about that is that I think we horribly underestimate the terrible damage that is done to people convicted of crimes and to society in general of incarceration. We are far too quick on the trigger to put people in jail. So we need to reevaluate that, and we need to think about alternatives. And what those alternatives need to be, I think, require brainstorming at this point.
I think it was a fascinating talk. You made this interesting case about how delegating punishment to authority enables people to forgive. That was one of the points you made. But there is bodies of law that talk about forgiveness. So there's some, what does that serve? Any thoughts about that? So this is not an individual forgiveness that supposedly is good for you, but the fact that society as a whole has mechanisms to forgive.
So, although I don't think a society can forgive. Right. So that's not the same kind of forgiveness. I'm talking about psychological forgiveness. I'm talking about feelings of reconciliation.
My question is, what do you think about these bodies of law that have forgiveness as part of them? Forgiving, what do you think about it? I'm just curious.
I'm not sure that I know what bodies of law you're referring to.
For example, in South Africa, forgiving
reconciliation and restorative justice. Is that the?
No.
Not.
Forgiveness, saying somebody says I committed a crime and now they're being forgiven. There's this whole book of Martha Minow about forgiveness in the law. She goes through certain corpses of law where they talk. Forgiveness is something you can grant. Anyway.
Again, because I'm not familiar with that particular, but I do want to say something about it. It might be related to restorative justice. And so I'm teaching a class this semester in the legal studies department here, and about memory and the law. And one of the topics that we dealt with was restorative justice, because basically it involves rewriting memory of the people who were victims of crime and of the offenders and whatever. And I put before the class a suggestion, well, maybe we could do without incarceration if we engage in these restorative justice processes where you have victim offender conferences and where the victim confronts the offender and the offender has to take responsibility for their action. And the class responded, well, that's all very nice, but they need to be punished. Okay? So even if the restorative processes and the forgiveness which can result from them are our ultimate goal, because we do want, in most cases, to enable an offender to rejoin society and to once again participate in social interactions, we are not going to be satisfied unless there is an element of punishment. That's what seems to be expressed by all the cases, I shouldn't say all the cases, many different cases in which we see how people respond to particular situations. Like the study I mentioned of Carl Smith and colleagues, in which people talk one game but do the other. Yeah.
Hi there, Dr. Levy. Thank you for coming and giving this talk today. I feel that in your early on in the presentation, when you were talking about the Code of Hammurabi versus the Bible, and sort of how it seems like the Bible, or the Tanakh, if you will, discards the notion of punishing children for their parents' crimes or vice versa. But then you quoted Deuteronomy 5:9 to basically, to sort of imply that there aren't really that many differences, or that in this area that the Bible actually agrees with the Code of Hammurabi. But I'm not sure which translation you were using there. Maybe it's different from the one I'm reading, but the ones that I read say something along the lines of visiting the sins of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me. So it's not talking about punishing children or grandchildren for their parents' sins, but it's for continuing in their parents' sins that the children are punished.
Yeah.
So
How do I address that?
Yeah.
With a careful investigation of biblical syntax, which I'm not going to go into right now, but it's all dependent on the placement of the word "to those who hate me," right? It's like, is it object genitive or subject genitive? We're not going to go into that right now, but we would like to read it as referring to the fact that God is only vengeful to those who continue to be bad, but that is not the simple meaning of the reading of the text. And it's especially not the simple reading of the text when we look at the ancient Near Eastern background of biblical literature, and we understand that this notion of punishing the family of the offenders is widespread. So this is, an issue for historical biblical study. I think that there is an argument to be made that when we see these kinds of ideas in the biblical literature, we need to take them seriously as reflecting something very deep about human nature. And that's really all I want to take from it, for the purpose of this consideration of contemporary punishment.
Next question is here.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I thought it was really well put together. But I thought some of your premises were a little bit culturally specific. And I wanted to bring up this issue of high tax, high service societies versus low tax, low service societies. And it seems to me that under a low tax, low service regime, revenge, retail punishment might make more sense. That I think you coming from a social democracy, which the U.S. is moving away from rather than towards, it seems, in the last generation or so, leads you to be more of an advocate for this notion of let the state take the place of clannish or individual family issues of punishment. But it seems as though U.S. practice, and practice in a lot of other places in the world right now, is moving more in the direction of allowing families to witness capital punishment, or otherwise moving things away from being under the aegis of the state and being more under issues of familial or individual recompense for crimes that are committed on them. And in a libertarian setup, maybe that is a better payoff. That if you're gaming it out in the game system, the revenge makes more sense in those situations.
Yeah. So there are complexities here, and there is definitely a lot of cultural relativism involved over here, but that just means each culture, each society needs to answer this question according with their own values. I will say that any society which devolves into vigilante justice is going to be in bad shape. That's really bad, okay? On the other hand, when you mention about the families of victims being involved in witnessing punishments which are possibly prescribed by the society, that is a recognition of this need for recompense and for sort of psychologically closing the circle and the involvement. Now, this is also something which is very important. Very often in the justice system, the victim is totally ignored by, like in a trial context, in which victims are, not only present to sort of state their complaint against the defendant, but they're also cross-examined to death and basically, undergo a very, very challenging experience. And unless you have the institutions of restorative justice, which enable the victims to get some sort of psychological recompense and correction of the suffering that they've undergone, then you have inordinate numbers of people in society who continue to be the victims of crimes long after the act might have been punished by an official penal system. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in getting to a situation which is going to be good for everybody.
Thank you very much for the lecture. Is there any publications that you have written that we can get a hold of? Books so we can order or something like that?
I'm glad that you asked. Actually, there's a free article, anyone can download it from the internet, that I've written about this topic. And I'll be you can Google me and I'll send it to anybody who is interested. So, and there, a lot of the things I didn't have time to go into, a lot of the animal behavioral literature and the neuroscience literature, I've just given a little sampling of some of the relevant factors.
It's kind of hard to follow when you have a whole lecture. You need to kind of read it in more detail.
I'm always in favor of homework.
In your lecture, you mentioned punishment of relatives of the perpetrator. In Israel, now terrorists who commit acts, the house where they grew up is destroyed. This is probably one of the things you're talking about, and do you feel that this is appropriate or effective?
Yeah, so I'm not an expert on security matters, so I really can't speak to whether it's effective or not. I do think that, before there was the point raised about cultural specificity. So in Israel, the notion that family members of a terrorist are going to pay a price as a result of those terrorist acts. First of all, there is a belief in Israel, and I don't know whether this is true or not, that will deter terrorists from committing those acts. Secondly, there is also a belief that members of the family would have had some notion that their family member was about to commit an act of terror and that they should have done something in order to prevent it. Again, is this justified or not? Is this effective or not? I don't know. But I do not think that it is retributive in this sense. I think that there is again, I'm speaking as an Israeli, and I don't know if I support that policy. I would support it if it's effective in preventing loss of life from terrorist acts. If it isn't, then there's no point to it. So it's an empirical question of whether it works or not.
Question over here.
Hi. I liked your lecture. I did not understand a great deal of it. I spent about 20 years as a capital defense attorney. That means defending those people who have been convicted and sentenced to death in the state of California, and 10 years before that as just a regular public defender. And I think the issue of race and class greatly complicates the structure and thoughts you put forward. Most of my clients come from communities that are not part of the United States I live in. The police do not respond to calls. I, as a white person, when I was visiting my clients' families and friends in certain parts of South Central, I was out before dark. we only drove cars that were certain colors. Like the intensity of disenfranchisement in a way that I don't think many of us can understand, where the schools are nothing but detention centers, where there's no safety, where there's no money, where there's really no police. That is an entirely different story than the story you're telling. And that is the story that, in my experience, many, if not most, of the people incarcerated in California come from. And on top of it, in the prisons, we have a lot of gangs. And those gangs are pretty dang violent. And I'm not saying they're good people or bad people, I'm just saying these are the realities I see. And so somehow that has to be, well, I encourage you to consider how those factors play into the comments you're making. And in terms of physical public punishment, I think the play was called The Lottery, the short story. Shirley Jackson.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to work out, based on that story, I don't think that's going to work out well in any society. And given the history in the United States of the physical mistreatment of communities of color, including the Native peoples, I would leave. If I was told that criminals are going to be flogged in public, this would not be the country I lived in anymore. I would go somewhere else, because it's horrible, and it reminds me of some of the worst parts of our history.
Thank you for putting a few important points on the table. I, feel like I should apologize for not perhaps showing the connection between the kind of general ideas that I'm considering, which were not written in the context of the state of California or even the United States. Although, as I mentioned, I'm originally from New York. I've lived in Israel for the last 40 years. Our minority is a whole different, right? And every country is going to have its majorities and minorities, and with the different forms of social inequality. And in some cases, it's going to be more relevant for this. In some cases, it's going to be less relevant. One of the sort of rude awakenings that I've had now, coming back to spending a year here in California after living in Israel for 40 years, regards the situation of Black Americans and the challenges that they deal with, every day. And I'm learning about that and trying to think of, what might be done in that regard. We definitely need to take all the issues of social equality and inequality into consideration before engaging in any particular, policy. But you're putting your finger on the problem of having just prison as our only option. And I understand your immediate psychological response, like flogging somebody in public, that's primitive, that's inhumane, that's brutal, it's whatever. And I just don't know if putting somebody behind bars for 20 years is more humane than flogging them in public.
I didn't say any of that. I didn't say it's brutal, I said that it recollects a horrible part of the history of the United States.
Okay, and that you would leave?
Yes.
Well, because you don't want to have any part of that.
I am already deeply ashamed by that history.
Yeah.
And I
So-
don't want to react it. I don't want to play act it.
Okay, but if it were not part of, there are other countries in the world today that we consider to be less civilized than Western nations, in which corporal punishment is used. Okay, certain other countries, I don't know the details well enough to describe them, but in certain parts of Asia, this is something which is acceptable. So it's culturally relative. It's what you're used to. It's sort of like what we eat, where we think that the people who eat those other things, what, eat horses? Americans can't eat horses. Well, but in France it's perfectly okay. I mean, there's so many things that we think are sort of fundamentally revolting that you begin to realize that they are very culturally relative. So, again, I'm a theoretician. I'm not writing laws. I'm not proposing legislation. I'm not even teaching in the law school. I just give a course on memory. But I am in favor of understanding our underlying psychology in order to think more creatively about what might do the job better than what's being offered now, because I think that most people agree that the current system is broken. And the question is, what could be better?
Hi. So, fellow neuroscientist and a biologist and a perpetual optimistic person, I want to offer maybe another look at the biology. You talked about activation of the reward system, striatum, reward circuitry there is very similarly activated with altruistic acts, even in animals, in rats. We reported it in rats, for example, right? So, and many, many different others. So there is a biological basis for other altruistic stuff as well. And seeing good activates the same system, right? And then a story that maybe you're aware of, maybe people know from Robert Sapolsky, professor of neuroscience at Stanford University. I don't say Stanford here, but he's my postdoc mentor, so we can sort of get him into the family. And he has an interesting story. He studied primates, right? He studies baboons and African, and has studied them for many, many, many years. And the system there is both very hierarchical and very much based on violence. And access to food is denied of the lower ones and so on. And then one day, after working with the same tribe for 20 years or so, Robert went back there and realized that there was a disaster. About half or 30% of the tribe disappeared, died. And he followed what happened there, and what happened is there was a new resort, and the alpha and beta males and some of the alpha females were the only ones that had access to the wonderful food that they could get at the resort. It also brought with it TB. They got sick, and they were eliminated from the population. And a new society came up there. In the new society, he called the Pacific Culture Society, and he followed them for a few decades after that, and they had very, very different rules. In a biological, very ingrained biological system, as we think about it, right, the males actually leave and new ones come. They adapted to this new culture, and that's biology too. So also ingrained in our biology is some propensity for good and for other ways of running this system, I think. That was a common question.
Yeah. I mean, that the elimination of alpha males is generally a good thing for society. And I'm a great admirer of Sapolsky, and yeah, he's phenomenal. But we need to track that society a little longer, because every human and animal society eventually develops inequalities. I mean, this is just what we see. And there's no doubt that we get a lot of pleasure out of being good to other people. And that's a whole separate lecture. And I wouldn't even give it because that's not my field. But yeah, people can be really good under conditions of reciprocal altruism and kin selection and a whole bunch of other factors that we're not talking about yet today. But we always need to have a mechanism to make sure that in really complex situations, everybody's playing the game fairly. Because we have an innate tendency to take care of ourselves first. And if that involves taking resources from somebody else, that's what we're programmed to do. So you need rules, and you need ways of enforcing the rules. That's all. Once you have rules and ways of enforcing the rules, you also get a society in which people feel secure enough so that they can be charitable to other people. under the principles of reciprocal altruism. I can take care of my needy brother and sister when I have more and they don't, because they'll take care of me when I'm in need. But in order for that to work, you need mechanisms of reinforcement, which is punishment plus other things which are required. So it's all a question of balance. It's a society which is well balanced will find the sort of, I think, intuitively, the way of doing that best. The challenge is that our societies today are so complex, and that the inequalities and imbalances occur so quickly that we don't have enough time to readjust to take new realities into account. And because of technology, and in other words, all the processes which could happen in an effective fashion under ordinary evolutionary pressure, today we just don't have the time to make those evolutionary adjustments. And that's why it's so hard to be a modern human being.
We're in our last minute or two, so we're going to take the two last questions here at the same time, and then maybe you can respond to them.
Okay, two quick questions. First, you focused on the society, but there is a whole body of literature about the incentives of the people who commit the crimes. And there is research about the fact that they are more deterred about the probability of them being caught is more deterrent than punishment. And there is a body of literature about in the high risk, people are risk averse. And so I'm not sure that if you combine the two sides of the cognitive literature, you will receive the same result if you're speaking normatively. And my second comment is that nowadays we see phenomena that actually go along with your theories, that the shaming in social networks or the abolishment, and I'm not sure it works. So I'm not sure it's positive. So what do you think about it?
My question's about the punishment of the executioner. Why is it, like in our country, we have so many different mechanisms and policies that let law enforcement off the hook, like a qualified immunity. Like, why is it society we shrug our shoulders at people like at Rikers Island being held for years without even being formally charged for shoplifting, for instance? Yet so much of our society reacts strongly to punishing officers for violating the law and executing people for running away from them while unarmed.
Yeah.
And a third question.
One final question here.
1, 2, 3, yeah.
Thank you. So I wanted to follow up on that example you gave of the monkeys and the 6-year-olds who desired to see the punishment of antisocial actors. But what was their response to seeing the punishment of pro-social actors? Because I feel like a piece we haven't engaged yet, I mean, there seems to be these psychological benefits to seeing someone punished if you believe them to in fact be a criminal. But we're in a moment in which there's a deep, and I think justifiable, distrust in our legal system in America, and in our level of confidence that the people who are being punished, regardless of whether we think the punishments make sense, whether they in fact should be. So from a psychological perspective, how does that play out for society when none of this punishment necessarily feels like it can be relied on to be justice?
Okay, we have pro-social, we have pro-social treatment, pro-social behavior, we have
Punishing executioner.
okay, punishing the executioner, and we have what about shaming, does that really work?
Yeah. So very quickly. So I think that what you're saying, what Matt's saying, it's basically the idea. Yeah, system, in order for any of this to work, the system has to work, right? If people who are given authority are abusing that authority, it's going to be bad. If we don't think that the people to whom we're giving this Leviathan-like stature are protecting our best interests, or then, but But sometimes we have, again, the psychological tendency being that we'd rather have the law enforcement authorities work aggressively to protect our interests because we believe ourselves to be innocent. If we were in the position, as mentioned before, members of society who start with, counts against them, so to speak, and are, considered to be suspect until, they're guilty until proven innocent, and those kind of problems, then this is not going to be good. So clearly, in order for this to work, the system has to work. We're just saying that if it is efficient, it can be effective. But if it's, punishing the wrong people, that's clearly a bad thing. As far as shaming, right? And of course there's a lot more to be said about that. As far as shaming, I think shaming works. I think that the shaming which goes on in social media is irresponsible because these are artificial communities. They're not real communities, right? If you don't like what 72,000 people are saying about you on Instagram, close your Instagram, right? Talk to your real friends. Live in your real community. So that, again, these are artificial circumstances which take sort of elements of fundamental human psychology and warp them in a way that they were not designed to accommodate. And that's why social media is such a problematic thing. We haven't evolved into the creatures that are capable of dealing with it properly. Maybe 100,000 years from now we will be. I hope not, but that remains to be seen.
And qualified immunity for the executioner.
Very qualified. No, that's what we're saying.
It's the same thing.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Let's have a round of applause for the